This is one of my favorite books. It's called The Relatives Came, written by Cynthia Rylant, illustrated by Stephen Gamma. It was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car. And in that station wagon, they put an ice chest full of soda pop and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches. And then up they came from Virginia. They left at 4 in the morning when it was still dark outside, before even the birds were awake. They drove all day and into the night, and while they traveled, they looked at the strange houses and the different mountains, and they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia, but they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up their pop and ate up their crackers and traveled up all those miles until finally they pulled up into our yard. And then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging. Those relatives passed us from one to the other, hugging, 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 crying sometimes. They hugged us for hours. Then it was into the house, and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 hugs just to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. Finally, after a big supper, 2 or 3 times around until everyone had a turn to eat, there was quiet talk. We were in 2s and 3s throughout the house. The relatives were not particular about beds, which was good. there were not enough. So a few squeezed in with us, and the rest slept on the floor. Some with their arms thrown over the closest person, and some with an arm thrown over one person and a leg thrown over the other. It was different. Trying to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed anything that was broken that they could find. They ate up all of our strawberries and melons, and then promised that we could eat up their grapes and peaches when we visited Virginia. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chest and headed back to Virginia at 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet, and we fell asleep. And the relatives drove on all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and the different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and they missed us. When they were finally home in Virginia, they crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about next summer. And that is the end of one of my favorite books. Remember that you are one of my favorite people. Go into the world and do good.